Hi, everybody. Today's focus would be on the central nervous system. We have talked about in our previous lecture about the CNS and how it is made up of brain and spinal cord. So we know that brain is protected by the skull, and your spinal cord is protected by the vertebral column that's going down the back. So when you look at the brain and the spinal cord, both of these are made up of what we identify as gray matter and white matter. So what is the difference between them? In the microscopic structure, the gray matter is made up of the neurons, cell body, and the dendrite portion, versus the white matter would be the myelinated axons of the same neurons. So when you look at the brain and the spinal cord, you will see these patterns that will be identified again as gray matter or white matter. And if you look at them in terms of microscopic anatomy, they basically identify different parts or components of a neuron, whether it be cell body or dendrite for the gray matter, or white matter being the myelinated axons. So your brain is made up of multiple structures. What we will be doing for today's lecture is basically looking at each of the structures, looking at a little bit of anatomy, and then looking at the physiology of the brain and how they work together to basically make our brain our control center for the body. So your brain is made up of the largest structure, or the largest structure of the brain is identified as the cerebrum, which is what is depicted in yellow. So this largest structure is your cerebrum. It is made up of a lot of folds and lines on the surface, which we'll learn about in just a few minutes, called the sulci and gyri. The inferior posterior aspect of the brain, you have this structure, which is called the cerebellum, extremely important in terms of coordination movements in the body. We have an internal structure, which is depicted right here and kind of enlarged right here. The structure is known as the diencephalon, which is made up of thalamus, which is this oval structure here, and a triangular structure underneath it called the hypothalamus. Again, hypo means below, thalamus. Now, this part is not labeled. It's technically part of the endocrine system, but this is a structure that is hanging off of the pituitary gland. This structure, hanging off of the hypothalamus, is called the pituitary gland, and it is involved in production of a lot of hormones that basically make sure our body is running properly. At the base of your brain, you have these three structures that combine together form what we identify as brain stem. Zoom-in version of this is made up of what we identified as midbrain. This kind of enlarged structure right here called the pons, and the last extension, which is medulla oblongata. Again, together these three structures make up your brain stem. And if you follow the brainstem going farther down, that would be your spinal cord. Now, one of the first things that you may have heard about in terms of brain is meninges. So meninges are three protective layers that are found around the brain. These three layers are known as pia matter, as the most outer layer, arachnoid matter, which is the second layer or middle layer, and dura matter is the innermost layer, arachnoid matter is the middle one, and dura matter is the outermost lining, which basically comes into contact with the skull. These are your three layers. Now, between the space which we identify as pia matter and arachnoid matter, we have a space called subarachnoid space. Within this space, we have a fluid flowing called the cerebrospinal fluid, or shorthand CSF. Now, this fluid is not only around the brain, as the name implies, it's around the brain and the spinal cord, but it's specifically around the brain. It's found with surrounding the brain within the space called subarachnoid space. which is between, again, arachnoid matter and pia matter. Now, one of the main goals of having this fluid around the brain is that it provides cushioning for the brain. So imagine if you had no fluid around the brain, as the brain is basically moved as a result of some sort of force or trauma from the external sources, brain will be bouncing off inside the skull, which can easily cause damage and rupturing of the blood vessels. However, if you surround the blood, surround the brain with a fluid, and that fluid can provide some level of protection for the brain. However, if the trauma or force is severe enough, then the brain will be bruised or scarred as a result of that movement. Now again, if the brain is literally bouncing off the side of the skull because of some sort of trauma, the fluid is not going to be enough to protect it, then that causes the bruising of the brain, which is better known as concussion. Now, swelling and tearing of the blood vessels can be results of a concussion. You may have heard of it. Concussion has different levels. So it could be mild all the way to severe, which can cause, again, internal injuries. Now, typically, if the concussion is not severe enough, having a concussion will not have a long-lasting effect on the brain tissue. However, for individuals who are more susceptible to concussions, like people who play contact sports like football or kickboxing or boxing, this kind of a continuous and repeated concussions may cause brain tissue in long term to be damaged and cause mental problems at later age. Now, another thing that you may have heard of it is a medical condition called meningitis. Meningitis, as the name implies, it implies the swelling of the meninges as a result of an infection. That infection could be a result of a virus or a bacteria or even a fungus. Typical symptoms is very similar to flu. It could be headaches, fever, a stiff neck, which is the result of, again, inflammation of the meninges. Here in this picture, you can see kind of the 3 healthy layers of meninges around the brain. And in this picture, you can see the swelling or the inflammation of the meninges, which also affects the brain tissue. Now, diagnosis of somebody who has meningitis is through a procedure called spinal tap. They can either put the person laying on their side or sitting down in a sitting position. They pass a needle between the vertebra, so between the bony parts, and they tap into the fluid that flows around the spinal cord, as we mentioned, called CSF. And they check that for increase in white blood cell activities and sugar level. Typically, if this fluid is tested positive for either infection or increase in white blood cell count, that is a marker for a person having meningitis. Prevention, there are vaccines that may prevent various versions of meningitis, but it will not protect against all forms of viral or bacterial fungal infection that leads to meningitis. Now, let's go ahead and switch gear back to the components or structures of the brain, starting with the largest part of the brain called the cerebrum. Now, again, cerebrum is going to be about 80% of the mass of your brain. The most important jobs, and it's highlighted here so you can kind of start it for yourself as far as the importance. First of all, it receives the data from your sensory. So it's center for receiving the data, integrating as an it's going to make sense of it, right? And then it controls voluntary muscle response, which in this case only means what, guys? A skeletal muscle. So receiving center for your sensory data, right? Integrating that signal, but only corresponding to the motor branch, which is associated with a skeletal muscle. It will not be affected as a result of, or will not control a smooth muscle, glands, or cardiac muscle. So no effect on the involuntary actions. Now, when you look at the brain from the superior view, you do notice that there is a line that literally divides the brain to two hemispheres, and this is known as the longitudinal fissure. Fissure is basically means a deep sulcus, and sulcus itself, I think I have it. Sulcus means a shallow groove on the surface of the brain. So these patterns, in another sense, if you look at these patterns that you see on the surface of the brain, these are sulcus. But if the sulcus is deep, as in literally dividing a structure, and it, like your longitudinal fissure, that's then referred to as the fissure. Now, when you look at this, the brain is divided to two hemispheres. You have the right hemisphere and the left hemispheres of the brain. Now, the other part that you need to understand is, even though your brain is divided to two halves, you still do want to have these halves communicating with each other. So there is an extensive nerve bridge that allows these two halves to communicate. And this structure is what's depicted here as corpus callosum. So again, corpus callosum is a great mediator, as in it allows the two halves of the brain to communicate with each other, and basically making sure that the movement on the right hand side is coordinated with the left hand side, or the sensory data collected is collected from both sides, and they come together to basically make you aware of your environment. Now, there's a typical concept that people are one side or the other side is dominant. Now, what is the general understanding? That the left side of the brain is responsible for logic, language, science, math, analytical thoughts, critical thinking, versus the right side of the brain is more holistic thoughts, art, music, creativity, intuition. Now, you may have one side of the brain being more dominant, and I put that in quote unquote, as in you have a higher drive for math and science versus art and music, but that doesn't imply that if you don't put effort into those parts, you are lacking. So your brain, the two halves of the brain will be working together to basically give you the capacity to carry everything. So don't assume just because, for instance, you're good at art and music, you will not be good at science or math, or vice versa. Now, when we look at your cerebrum, one of the first things that we can see is that cerebrum is divided to 5 main lobes. The name of the lobes, actually, if you guys, for 4 of them, matches the name of the skull bones that you learn in the skeletal system. So you have the frontal lobe, you have the parietal lobe, the back of the brain is occipital lobe, and the sides of your brain is referred to as the temporal lobe. Now, if you remove or move the temporal lobe to the side, what you will see is additional folding underneath that, which is still part of the cerebrum, and those internal folds are referred to as insula. Now, again, we have looked at the function of the cerebrum briefly, as we talked about earlier, but kind of revisiting the same idea. So cerebrum has white matter and gray matter. Kind of a reminder for you guys, gray matter was the dendrite and the cell bodies, versus if I hear the word white matter, is referring to the dendrites of the neurons. So gray matter of the cerebrum, which is really superficial aspect of the brain, is called cerebral cortex. So let's say if I do a cross-section of, sorry, not a cross-section, a sagittal cut of the brain, or I'm sorry, a frontal part of the brain. So let's say this is my brain. These are the two halves of the brain. So here is the right in the middle is my longitudinal fissure. So if I'm looking at the most superficial aspect of the brain, so this really tiny layer, which is about 2 to 4 millimeter, very small. This superficial aspect of the brain is called the cerebral cortex. And then the underneath one would basically be the white matter. So again, even though cerebral cortex is relatively small, it does contain the dendrite and the cell body of most of the neuron in the cerebrum. And they are the ones that are actually going to do the job. So what is your cerebral cortex, which is again, this tiny layer, this superficial layer of the cerebrum actually responsible for? They receive the sensory data from all of your senses. Kind of a reminder, you have your common senses. You have your sense of touch, your sense of smell, your sense of taste, right? Your sense of vision, and your sense of auditory, right? And then on top of that, a couple of things that I mentioned before is sense of vestibular, which is sense of balance, and visceral, which is internal changes in your body, which includes, let's say, pressure on the bladder or a stomach ache or movement of the intestines. So things that you can be measured, but these are internal. So after you receive the data, the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to make sense of that data, right? So receiving sensory data, and then what? What's the second part? Making sense of the data. Receive, I want to kind of make sure this is clear, and make sense of that data. Next thing you do is you are allowing to create voluntary motion. Again, the voluntary motion is discussing the somatic branch of the nervous system, which controls the skeletal muscle and speech. It also controls your eye movement. And last one that I really didn't go into detail previously, cerebrum, which is again the largest part of your brain, is also responsible for things like critical thinking, multitasking, memory, problem solving, behavior changes, making you aware of the body position and the location of your body parts in terms of a space. So cerebrum, considering its size, is also extremely important in carrying quite a few functions in our body. Now, we learned that your cerebrum has 5 lobes, just kind of reminding of you guys. You have the frontal lobe, you have the parietal lobe, you have the occipital lobe, you have the temporal lobe, and then deep to the temporal lobe, you have a lobe called insula. Now, let's associate functions to each part of your brain. Let's start with the occipital lobe. Again, occipital lobe is going to be associated with receiving sensory data, but for what? For specifically your visual data. And the second part of it is going to give you the ability to make sense of that data. So 2 parts, guys. Again, remember that I'm describing this as 2 aspects, even when we were talking about here, receiving and then what? Making sense of the data. So first, what I can do is you can see, so let's say you're looking at an object in front of you. First thing is that you can see there is something in front of you. So step 1, you have received the data. The second part is distinguish that person or that object that's in front of you as either a friend, a clock, table, or whatever the object is. So understanding and processing that data is the second thing. So here again is the step 1, here is the step 2. Receive, right? Versus what? Making sense of the data. Now, if you have a stroke in the occipital lobe, it could either cause blindness, which is known as functional blindness, or it could cause the loss of ability to recognize objects. Make a distinction, guys. So if the damage is to the area that receives data, then you lose the ability to see. But if the damage is at a part that helps you distinguish objects, then you still would be able to see, however, you can't tell what you're actually seeing. Parietal lobe. So parietal lobe is associated with your sense of touch. So sense of touch is identified or described as somatosensory. And it's basically, again, two parts. I'm going to highlight this over and over, guys. Receiving the sensory data, and then what? The second part is making sense of that data. So let's say you put your hands in your pocket, right? The fact that you can feel something in your pocket, that's a step one. The fact that you're not touching your key versus your phone versus your wallet, making sense of what you're touching, that's part two, and it's still associated with the parietal lobe. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about the parietal lobe, so keep that in mind. In just a second, we'll go over it in a little bit more detail. Temporal lobe, which is located at the side of your head, it has two main functions. First, it receives sensory data from your nose, right? And then makes sense of it. Again, the sense of a smell is known as olfactory. So anytime from this point on, you hear the word olfactory, know that it's a sense of a smell. And again, smelling something and knowing what you're smelling is associated with, let's say, bread cooking, cookie, or trash. Second part of second function of the temporal lobe is receiving sensory data from your ear, which is basically your auditory or hearing, and then again, what? Making sense of that data. And keep saying this. This is step one, step two, right? You hear a noise, that's step one. Yes, I can hear. Second part, okay, I can hear that what I'm hearing is the music versus somebody talking to me versus a phone ringing, etc. Insula, which is deep underneath the temporal lobe, is associated with your sensory data, associated with your taste buds. Your sense of taste is known as the gustatory, and then again, making sense of that data. So here is your insula underneath the temporal lobe, and one of the main functions it corresponds to is your sense of taste or gustatory. Now, let me add a couple of pieces of information here for you guys. So insula is also responsible for what we identified as visceral, which is internal senses. This is again when you feel a stomach ache or a full bladder. These are associated with your insula. Another thing that you can associate with insula is sense of vestibular, which is sense of balance. And this is again, basically position of head in the space. Please do keep in mind, guys, that when we talk about the word vestibular, you're gonna see this in senses. It is part of ear, inner ear more specifically, called vestibuli, which is associated with the sense of balance as well. So a lot of time people, when they have ear infection, they feel vertigo. And then one of the main reasons is, or there is an imbalance in the inner ear. A typical symptoms is vertigo or dizziness. That's because of the vestibule being affected. Now, processing center. So when we looked at the lobes of the brain, we have talked about the parietal lobe. We talked about occipital lobe, we talked about temporal lobe, and we talked about insula. So one of the main lobes we haven't talked about is the frontal lobe. So frontal lobe is responsible for two other functions we described for the cerebrum or cerebral cortex. One is your processing center. Again, give you ability for memory, critical thinking, multitasking, solving problems. The other thing that you have is um, cognitive function, higher thinking process, behavior, and I go into more details as we go again through it. And then for your other function of the frontal lobe, you're creating voluntary movement. I'm going to keep saying, as soon as you hear the word voluntary, please only and only associate it with skeletal muscle, which is also implies is connected to the somatic nervous system branch as an controlling voluntary movement of the skeletal system. Now, before I move on, there's something that I wanted to add, and I don't see my slide. I think it comes up later, but I'm going to just draw it for you quickly to highlight a couple points for you on that picture. So here is a picture of my brain, and don't laugh at it. This is the best I can draw. So this in the back of the brain is your cerebellum, and this structure would therefore be cerebrum. Kind of associating, you will have your frontal lobe here, your parietal lobe here, occipital lobe here, and temporal lobe right here. Now, there is a line that is located right here, and this is a shallow groove which separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And this line that I've depicted is called the central sulcus. Now, the region that is immediately in front of the central sulcus. This one change my color. The area that is immediately in front of the central sulcus, which is, let's say, is this area. This is called the as in before, central gyrus. Gyrus, if you wonder what is the word imply, is basically the pattern or ridges on the brain. So all of those patterns that you can see on the brain, that's called the gyrus. So if it's immediately in front of the central sulcus, it's called the precentral gyrus, and it is associated with the frontal lobe. Now, going to the back of the, or right behind the central sulcus, you have another gyrus, and this gyrus is after it, so we call it postcentral gyrus. And this is part of, logically, would be part of your parietal, So why am I describing this? These two parts have a very specific function within your brain. The postcentral gyrus, which is part of the parietal lobe, is responsible for receiving data for your somatosensory. So if I ask you specifically which part of your brain receive data for your sense of touch, your answer should be postcentral gyrus. But if I simply ask you what lobe receives data for your somatosensory, then your answer would be the parietal lobe. So pay attention to the question. The lobe of the brain associated with somatosensory is the parietal lobe. But the lobe of the region of the brain that is associated with receiving data associated with somatosensory, that would be your postcentral gyrus. Now, area immediately in front, we talked about this, that being your Precentral gyrus, which is associated with your frontal lobe. Now, what is the main function of this? This is control a skeletal muscle movement. A skeletal muscle movement. So what we identified earlier as responsible for skeletal muscle movement, if I ask you specifically what the region, so you can make a note for yourself, the region would be what? Would be pre-central gyrus, which is again associated with your frontal lobe. Something else I would like you guys to add to this is when we're talking about voluntary movement, what does that also include in addition to the skeletal movement? It is also responsible for creation of a speech. So moving your tongue, vocal cords, everything coming together is associated with your frontal lobe. You actually have a specific region called the Broca's area that does that. The other thing that you have is what we consider muscle memory. So muscle memory is also associated with the frontal lobe, which basically means if you're repeating the same job over and over and over again, and you really don't need to think about this, that's muscle memory, which is also associated with the frontal lobe. And lastly, what we identify as eye movement. So eye movement is also part of the frontal lobe function. Now, if I ask you, the other thing that I wanted to add is if I specifically ask you what part of, sorry, I'm looking for my drawing. I guess I lost it. When I think about your frontal lobe, so let me just draw my quick brain again. So here's my brain, here's my cerebellum, which marks the back. So if this was your central sulcus, here was the precentral, here is your postcentral, this area of the brain, right in front of the brain, this is called the as in before, prefrontal area or cortex. And this is the area that's responsible for multitasking, again, problem solving, memory, critical thinking. Again, it is prefrontal cortex, but it is still part of what? It's still part of your frontal lobe. So it doesn't make a difference. It's just use more focus now. Now, I'm going to stop this PowerPoint and we'll continue with the next one for the second part of the central nervous system on the next recording.